I've heard about oikos for quite a number of years, and I've always admired it as an initiative and as a network, and it's extraordinary how it's expanded over time. But an invitation came through, and one of my colleagues said, "You must do this." So that's how it happened.
About education and educational organizations today.
Well, I work in the sustainability field, which is things like climate change. So people think this is so urgent, we really haven't got time to educate people. But I think education is absolutely central. People say it's the most important investment we make as societies, and Oikos is right smack bang in the middle of that landscape. So, and it's been fascinating to hear the presentations during the day, many different facets of education, but particularly the business education world, which is really, I think, centrally important. Well, I think one of the things I found most interesting was when a couple of the students in the audience challenged IBM around, so you're flying all these people in different parts of the world, and the response was not as clear as it might have been. And I think, the answer could have been, well, we offset that, but actually the return on the investment of carbon is immensely important, and this is how that operates. So it's still interesting to see parts of that old conversation still stuttering along.
That's true. I mean, it's important to. What are your thoughts on the comparison between code and network, for example, education in the economy and society today?
Well, when you hear that about an old order collapsing, a new order coming through, struggling to be born, people tend to think about, well, Havel, that was about politics, but it was also about an economic order. But I think something much more fundamental is happening, and I think an old paradigm is breaking down. And that happens every 70 or 80 years, and it takes about 70, 80 years for a new paradigm to come through. And once it comes through, people think differently, they see the world very differently. And it's interesting that a couple of the presentations earlier on talked about some of the people who went out into space in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and came back transformed. And I think we're working through the collapse of an old paradigm and the emergence of a new one. It's an incredibly exciting time in history, but for a lot of people who are still stuck in the old order, it's incredibly frightening, and therefore the rest of us, it's politically quite dangerous too.
Yeah. Do you think this order or this evolution has to do with?
So we were doing what was set to be a short report, mainly for the business community, and about 5 weeks before we sent the thing to the printers to be published, one of my colleagues said, "No, it's fine. Everyone's writing reports. No one's reading them. Why don't we do something different? Why don't we do a play?" And so we did. We dramatized a board meeting, and right towards the end of that dramatization, two young millennials who've been invited into the board meeting, they both sort of in different ways erupt and basically say, "Look, this is our future, and here's how we see it." And because of a really interesting chairwoman, that has a quite important influence on the direction of the conversation.
So do you think that the millennials are the big guns? They're gonna create a lot of.
I think we're putting a lot on the millennials. I think they're going to be operating, they are already operating in a pretty disrupted environment. Some of them will be disruptors, and others will find it really quite difficult. Because I think there are a whole series of economic and political and social changes going through at the moment. So I don't envy the millennials, but I meet enough of them who are innovative and entrepreneurial and just determined to change the world. So I hope they will do that.
Yeah, well, we are very challenged for this with.
So I think one of the biggest challenges, and not just for the millennials, this is for everyone who's going to be in employment of some description or looking for it in the coming decades. We're all going to continuously have to keep learning and re-educating ourselves, and quite often going back to university. And some people will really enjoy that. I mean, I personally love to learn new things, but a lot of people will also find that quite challenging.
Oikos organization can see how far
I think students generally have a much bigger influence than they might imagine. It's like politicians, they only get a few letters from the people who vote for them. But so when they do get letters, they pay rather more attention than you might imagine. It's the same with supermarkets. Most consumers don't write or don't complain about things or congratulate people. And it's the same in the academic and the educational world. And I think a network like oikos has immense power, potentially, to not only gain people's attention, but to communicate emerging priorities of younger people. So it's often frustrating because you see educational systems that don't seem to change. Yet if I compare it over when I went to university, it's changed immensely, and that process has only just begun.
You said that you were studying economics for 1 year.
Yeah.
Well, I was studying economics in 1967-68, and in 1968, everything started to change. So there were student riots in the streets, and the Vietnam War was just in its early stages, at least for the Americans and so on. And economics was about the theory of the firm, and it was about pricing. And I was really interested in economic history and macroeconomics, that bigger picture story, but that wasn't what was being taught. Now I think economics is changing and changing for the better, but it's taken a long time.
Yeah, I think
I think also that again, back to the multiple forms of capital that capitalism has to tackle. It used to be just physical and financial capital, but now economists and accountants are having to deal with social capital and human capital and intellectual capital and natural capital. And the question is how you pull all of this together and integrate it into accounting. And I think some of the younger accountants and economists really get this, and they're storming ahead. The older generation is often finding this quite challenging and quite complicated, but that's fine. We'll just sweep them out of the way over time.
What do you think that the Canadian capitalism has to do with increased industry?
Well, I think one of the things that business has sort of concluded from a lot of this discussion over time is that corporate social responsibility and corporate citizenship is the way to go. To be better, to be nicer, to be a bit more transparent, and that's fine. That's useful to have, but I think we're at a period in all of this where the economy is going to be changed and changed quite significantly. So it's not just about being nicer, it's not about being better or more transparent, it's also about developing the new technologies, the new business models, and the new market rules that will actually guide capitalism into the future. And most companies haven't yet got to that point, but the sort of more thoughtful leaders can see it coming.
Yeah, so I guess this
Yeah.
Well, I think if you look back through economic history, what often evolves economies is depressions and wars. I mean, unfortunately, that's the way it's, because people get locked into an old order and find it very difficult to break out. And the question now is, do we need another major depression? Do we need another set of wars in order to drive that, or can we decide ourselves to drive it? And I'm an optimist. I think some of these signals, like climate change, is starting to build so powerfully that the mandate for politicians and for business leaders to change will be here much more powerfully than most people currently imagine, and quite quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm in the very peculiar situation of finding myself a visiting professor at 3 universities in the UK, and I speak at other business schools and so on. And I tend to parachute in and then parachute out, which is a sort of privileged position to be in. I'll continue with that. I'll continue working with younger people, and one of the absolute joys in this space is how younger people are really attracted into this sort of sustainability and social innovation and social entrepreneurship and impact investment space. And part of what we do is just support them as they try and find their footing, try and find roles. So hopefully a number of different ways. But the key thing is, for me, is to continue to be educated, not simply to educate the wider world. So thank you for the conversation.
Great. Thank you for this interview.